Hello, fifth graders. It's Mrs. Brace. I am happy to be here with you all. I hope you can hear me clearly. I want you to take a look at the screen, and you probably recognize it from earlier in the school year. This should just be a nice little review. Mr. Walker should have gone over the proficiency scale with you for multiple accounts or first-hand and second-hand accounts. We did practice this quite a bit. I want to say in the second quarter when we were still switching classrooms. So because it's been a little while, we're going to go over it and just do a really quick review. And then we'll do a little bit of practice and we'll be able to move on. Okay, so I want you to bear with me here and we'll see how we do. All right, if you remember the conversation we had about how information travels, right, from one person to the next. If we've, all of us have experienced something similar to this where someone, in this case, Julia, she's going to talk to Max over here and she tells Max that their music teacher is engaged. And Max is like, what? No way, crazy, are you sure, right? And then Julia, like Max wants to know how she knows, and so Julia says, well, we were at a restaurant and Miss Thompson and her boyfriend were sitting near and he proposed to her. And so Julia saw it with her own eyes, right? So then Max, he hears the story, and so he goes and decides he's going to tell Anna what he heard from Julia, right? So he goes up to Anna and says, oh, guess what? Our music teacher, Miss Thompson, is engaged. And Anna's like, no way. How do you know, right? And so then Max proceeds to tell her that Julia was the one that told him. And so that information passed from Julia to Max, right? And then from Max to Anna. And then suppose Anna goes ahead and tells other people, okay? So Julia would be considered the primary source in this situation, okay? We would call her the primary source. And she saw the actual event happening with her own two eyes. And so her account of the event was firsthand. She saw it herself. So Max, because Max didn't actually see it happen, he just heard about it from Julia, he is not considered a primary source, he's considered a secondary source because he heard about it from someone else, and then that labels him a secondhand account or labels his account secondhand because he heard it from someone else, okay? I'm sure it's all coming back to you. All right, so if Anna's the last one to get the news, right? Max is the one that tells Anna. So if Anna tells the news to her mom, will Anna be telling a first-hand account or a second-hand account? Okay, think about that for a minute. Anna tells the news to her mom. Did Anna see it with her own eyes or did she just hear about it from someone else? Okay, if you said second-hand account, you're absolutely right because she didn't see it. She just heard about it, right? She heard about it from Max. She didn't see it with her own two eyes. So when students read nonfiction, which is what you guys read, right, all the time, and just to remind you, nonfiction is true information, right? They should be able to determine whether the description is a first-hand account or a second-hand account, and that's what you guys are going to have to figure out, okay? So let's take a closer look at what they both mean. If you take a look at a first-hand account, we know that the description of the event is by a person who was actually there and saw it. Okay, they saw it with their own eyes. We can also say they witnessed the event. You can say it in a couple of different ways, right? But either way, they saw the event take place. Okay, so a little tip to help you remember is to think of a first-hand account with a person with a camera, like the little guy over in the corner there. He was there, he took the picture, okay? He witnessed it by himself, like he saw the event happen. He could have taken pictures if he wanted to because he saw it, okay? These are also called primary sources, so a first-hand account or a primary source. And here's some common examples of primary sources, okay? We talked about this as well. The first thing we talked about was an autobiography. And remember, an autobiography is something, information about someone's life that's written about that or written by that person, right? So if we found an autobiography about George Washington or anybody, the autobiography is something that's written. George Washington would have written the autobiography, okay? He wrote it about himself, all right? So that's called a primary source because did they, were they part of the events that happened in their lives? Absolutely, okay? Then we have diary entries, which are primary sources because they're written by the person who experienced the event. Okay, letters written to somebody, interviews, the person was actually there interviewing, right? Legal documents, videos of an event. Remember, you have to be there in order to video it, so you would definitely be a primary source. And then also photographs. Okay, you have to be at the event to photograph it, so you have to witness it with your own two eyes. Okay, so secondhand accounts, it's a description of an event by a person who was not present when the event occurred, right? So they weren't there, they just heard about it from somebody else. And then 9 times out of 10, it's almost always given after the event has happened. So the event takes place, and then someone sees it, and then they go tell somebody else, right? So the event has already happened. A secondhand account is a description of an event often based on research. So I want you to think for a second about your animal adaptations projects that you did. You guys spent weeks and weeks researching information, right? That other people had written about. And then you talked about your animals. You talked about their adaptations. You talked about their behavioral and physical adaptations. That was all based on someone else's research, someone else's writings. So that would have been considered a secondhand account, okay? A tip to help you remember, think of a secondhand account as a person reading a book. The person telling the account was not at the event they're describing and quite possibly gathered his or her information from a book. So think about a social studies textbook or anything along those lines. A textbook, your zoo books that you read about your animals, those would all be considered a secondhand account, okay? We also, just like with the first-hand account, we like to call them primary sources as well. With a second-hand account, they're also called secondary sources, okay? Secondary sources. So common secondary source examples would be a biography, which is like the opposite of an autobiography, right? So a biography is going to be, let's say someone writes a biography about George Washington. George Washington is not the one who reads it, or sorry, he's not the one that writes it. Someone just researched George Washington and then wrote about his life, okay? A history textbook like we talked about, okay? It's all researched information from someone else. Any kind of report, like your animal adaptation report, right? A movie, an encyclopedia, drawings of an event. So let's go back to movies for a minute. I want you to think in terms of a movie about, let's say Pearl Harbor. Okay, they make a movie about Pearl Harbor. Did the director of the movie or the writer of the movie, were they actually there at Pearl Harbor? Chances are probably not. Okay, they're going off of research of someone else to create the movie. And then remember, an encyclopedia, you can look up just about anything you want and it's going to give you a snippet of information about it that's based on research. And then a drawing of an event. Think about a drawing of an event. Remember when we talked about the first Thanksgiving and we looked at those 3 different illustrations or paintings that people had drawn, and we had the conversation, did the people who drew those pictures, were they at the first Thanksgiving, or were they going off of research based on the event? Okay, so they weren't there. They researched the event, and then they were drawing a picture that they thought depicted what the actual event looked like. So that would be a secondary source. So to determine whether a written piece, okay, any kind of nonfiction writing, if it's a first-hand account or a second-hand account, we've got to ask ourselves 2 critical questions, okay? The first question is who wrote it? Okay, who is the author of the account? And then the second one is, was the author present when the event happened? So when they wrote it, were they actually there? Okay, if the answer to that question is yes, then it's a first-hand account. Okay, if the answer to that question is no, it's a second-hand account, which means they heard it from someone else or they read about it from somewhere else, but they weren't at the event when it actually occurred. Okay? All right, so let's take a couple of minutes and just go over a couple pieces here and we'll practice. This should be very familiar to you, right? We're gonna practice using those 2 questions. So we're gonna read this about receiving a letter, and then we're gonna determine whether or not it's a first-hand or second-hand account, but we're gonna use those two essential questions, okay? So you receive a letter from your cousin Ben, who has been away at camp all summer. He tells you all about the fun activities that he has gotten to do while at camp. So the first thing we have to think of is, what are we looking at here? We're looking at the letter, right? The letter is what we're focusing in on. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, well, who wrote it? Who's the author? Okay, in this case, we know that the author is Ben. Okay, the author is Ben. And then the second question is, was Ben present at the events that he's describing? Okay, so we know that Ben is away at camp all summer and he's writing this letter to his cousin about all the fun activities that he was able to do at camp. So was Ben present at all of those activities that he's telling about? Absolutely, right? He was there. So if he is there, is that a first-hand or a second-hand account? Think about that for just a second. He was there, he witnessed it with his own eyes. So that means it is a first-hand account, okay? We have to be able to prove it, remember? So you can't just say, oh, it's a first-hand account. We've got to say it's a first-hand account because Ben is the author and he's writing about his own experiences at camp, right? All right, let's take a look at the next one. In January, one of your classroom periodicals features articles about Martin Luther King Jr. So that'd be like a magazine, a periodical, okay? The first article you read summarizes important events in his life. Okay, so you're reading through this magazine that's in the library, and we come to an article about Martin Luther King Jr. Let's think about it for a minute. Who's the author? We don't really know, do we? We know that it's not Martin Luther King. He's not the author because it says it features articles about Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, so we know that he's not the author. Someone else is, right? Someone else, whoever is writing the articles in the magazine. So was the author present for these events? So we are going to ask ourselves, is Martin Luther King Jr. or was the author with Martin Luther King Jr. throughout all of the important events in his life? The answer is probably no. Okay, he researched the information about Martin Luther King Jr. and summarized it in a magazine article. So if the answer was no to that second question, then we think about for a second, is it a first-hand or is it a second-hand account? And think about how you know, okay? Okay, if you said it was a second-hand account, you are absolutely correct. But we have to have the why, right? And the why is probably the author wasn't there, okay? The author did not experience all of these events in Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. He probably read about them, researched them, and then summarized them for himself, right? All right, very good. Okay, so we're going to stop there. Nice quick little review of first-hand and second-hand account. Remember, you can view this at any time. If you need to go back for a quick review, please know that it's here, and you can review it at any time. You will probably be assigned an assignment on freckle, and you'll have to differentiate between first-hand and second-hand account. Read a passage and then determine who's telling this. Is it a first-hand? Is it a second-hand? And how do you know? And then you might have to do some comparing and contrasting. Okay? All right, good luck.